When the Supreme Court wrapped up its term last month, everyone was focused on two major decisions, of course, upholding the federal subsidies for the Affordable Care Act and legalizing same-sex marriage across the country.
But after those were handed down, the court issued a few other major decisions, including one that could fix everyone's favorite punching bag, Congress. It stemmed from a case in Arizona where an independent, nonpartisan commission creates the congressional districts. That power used to belong to the state legislature, which challenged that process. But the Supreme Court disagreed, ruling that the commission is perfectly okay.
Of course, this has huge implications here in Michigan, where the state legislature draws the districts. So whichever party wins the crucial elections has the power to control congressional districts for the next decade, which can lead to districts designed to keep one party in power. And we've got a great example here. Michigan's 14th district, which rollcall.com calls one of the country's most gerrymandered districts. If you don't believe that, just take a look at the map right there. It winds through Wayne and Oakland counties. It stretches all the way from Pontiac to the Grosse Pointes.
The Supreme Court's decision is renewing the call for Michigan to come up with a nonpartisan commission to draw these districts to create competitive and fair elections. In a recent Free Press guest column, Jocelyn Benson, the dean of Wayne State's law school, wrote, "An independent redistricting commission can protect our representative democracy from being choked into extinction by partisanship and self-interest."
And she joins us now to talk about this, Dean Benson. If every state created one of these commissions, Michigan included, could this fix Congress?
Potentially. It certainly would make the process of electing our representatives more fair and more accurate and a better representation of the country.
Well, so even if you just sort of casually pay attention to Congress, you know the House has become significantly more polarized over the past several years. Is that because of how the districts are drawn?
Yes, in many ways the districts are drawn, regardless of which party's in charge, to manipulate the process in a way that would benefit one party or the other. And so what we have as a result is, instead of competitive districts, you have districts where one party dominates the process, so that the winner of the entire district is really selected in the primary, and that leads to the much more hyper-partisan elected officials that we're seeing today.
Now, I see a problem on the horizon here, and I guess I'm a little jaded because I've covered politics for so many years, but these commissions obviously are created by somebody, and how do you get the politics out of that particular mechanism where you don't have a political commission now doing essentially the same thing Congress does?
Well, right. The court talked about elected officials manipulating the process to further their own interests as opposed to the voters' interests. And we've seen in states like Arizona, which was the subject of the case, as well as California, when you put voters in charge of the process, it actually does create more competitive, fair districts that don't necessarily support either party's interests, but support the public, the voters' interests. So we've got these examples in California and Arizona that we could follow here in Michigan to make our process more fair.
Well, what about voter turnout? I mean, would this also help with that if the districts are more competitive and fair?
We've certainly seen voter turnout decrease significantly over the past several years, and I think in part that's because of a growing disconnect between us, the public, and our elected officials. And so putting us, the public, in charge of drawing the districts that elect those elected officials can take us one step, in fact a lot of steps closer, to actually creating a process where we feel connected, engaged, and I think we will see turnout increase as we have in states that have independent commissions like this.
So Dean Benson, if you can, walk us through the process. If you were in charge, if somebody came up and tapped you on the shoulder and said, you're in charge of creating this commission that is going to redraw the district, how do you start? How do you go about doing that?
Well, first I think you have to have a broad process to involve as many people as possible. The most important thing here is that the change is driven by the public, by the people, and not by any particular special interest. So engaging people across the state, which is what was done in California and Arizona, is the most important thing. And then number two, you do have to create a process where the general public, not elected officials, are drawing the lines, and that there are as many steps apart from the selection of partisanship as possible. So in California, you actually have a process where the state auditor collects applications. Anyone can apply to be on the commission, and then through multiple steps that involve some veto power and some just random selection, you actually create a commission that is representative of the entire state as opposed to any particular one interest.
But is there any way to really make sure that commission is truly nonpartisan? Is that even possible?
Well, in California, the commission drew the lines for this most recent congressional map, and both parties were upset with the results, which I think is a pretty good sign that it's an independent result.
Okay.
Now, here in Michigan, obviously, you're going to have to convince the legislature to do something like this. The Republicans aren't going to let go because it's working fine for them, and then when the Democrats win, it'll be working fine for them. So how are you going to convince them to take it out of their hands and let the people do this?
Certainly, I think it's very clear across the board, and even the court recognized this, the Supreme Court, in their decision, that the legislature doesn't necessarily have an incentive to change the process in which they were elected, so it does have to come from the voters. And in Michigan, we do have the ability to amend our Constitution through a ballot initiative that can be a statewide ballot initiative where voters can say yes or no as to whether or not they want to have the power to draw their district lines as opposed to allowing elected officials to draw their own districts.
All right, Dean Jocelyn Benson, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey, we love the idea of putting it back into the power of the people. You think it can happen?
We'll see.
It could happen.